Starting a new project. So imagine that you've got really enthusiastic about some free software idea and you want to start a new project. What do you do? Well, first of all, the burst of enthusiasm is really important because it's a lot of work getting a project going, getting people to start participating. Even with the canned hosting sites like SourceForge, it's still a fair bit of work to start pushing the project and be a really active project leader at the beginning. And if you want the project to be successful, I mean, a lot of projects suggest that they throw it up on SourceForge and then ignore it, and the project tends to wither and die very quickly. But if you really want the project to take off, it requires a lot of energy and enthusiasm at the start. And so most of them do start with somebody with a great burst of enthusiasm, and usually it's one person or a small group of people who've got that burst of enthusiasm. Few projects actually think about all the issues of running a FOSS project at the start. And maybe if they thought about, gosh, I'm going to be working on this for the next 20 years, they might get scared and not do it. But I'm very glad that they don't, in a way, and people do actually, put the effort in to get started. Because it is very rewarding working on a FOSS project. So there's different ways of doing it. You can follow a recipe. And there are various recipes available. I mean, that book, Producing Open Source Software by Carl Fogel, that I've pointed you at, is a good book on how to start a free software project and all of the issues involved. And it's basically a much more in-depth study than this little lecture is going to be. And so if you are starting a project and you're hoping it to be a big project, reading through that book is really worthwhile. And so you can use recipes out of that book. You can use recipes that are online. There's various tutorials and web pages on how to start a project. But remember also that a good cook also improvises. If you're slavishly following a recipe, that will often tend to dampen the enthusiasm. And the enthusiastic side of it is what gets in new developers. So don't lose the enthusiasm in the process of actually creating the project. Okay. So, what do you need out of other people when you're starting the project, right? Do you need help to implement it, or do you need motivation and feedback from them? If you think about that, do you want to mostly code it yourself for the first few months, and you really just want people to give you feedback on whether it's good and bad, and whether they like it and what features they want to see? Or is it that you actually think that you want other people to write the code and you just want to take all the glory? Or do you want to cooperate on the code? What sort of project do you want? How do you want the community to work? And because the way you get started with the project will tend to set the scene for later development. And so you need to think about how you want it to work. Okay, and most people probably think they can write the first version. I'd say most projects, it's one or two people that write the first version and get it started. And often their announcement of the project is really a request for some motivation, from some reinforcement from other people to say, yes, that's a great idea. And so if you see a project announcement and you think it's a great idea and you think you might use the project, respond to them. Say, that looks like a great idea, I'd use that, good luck with it, something like that, because that will encourage them. It's far more likely that they will work on the software and produce it if they think there are people who actually will appreciate it and use the project. And if you give them some ideas, you might say, oh, have you seen this library that would really help? Or have you seen that? Give them some suggestions, and they might appreciate those suggestions. Okay, if you do need development help in the early stages of the project, then setting up the infrastructure well at the beginning is especially important to make it easy for other people to participate. The source code management system, the bug tracking system, all of the infrastructure that you need in the project that you guys have seen when working on your lab projects in the last few days, getting that infrastructure set up is important if you want other developers to help out in the early stages. Things to think about. What are the project aims? So what's the project aiming to do? Is it just a bit of fun, a hack? Is it aiming to satisfy some business need, some need in the free software community? Is it scratching your own itch? Is it scratching some friend's itch? Is it that a friend needs some capability in their software and that you're trying to help them out? Work out what your aims are and make those aims clear. When you announce the project and put it up on the home page, say what you're aiming to do. But don't be too grandiose at first. A project that says, I'm going to write a complete new operating system that's going to replace all the others, I mean, that's a bit grandiose. Start a bit smaller than that. Start with something that people can imagine being completed in some reasonable period of time, because people want to see progress towards a goal. And if it's a bit too long-term and grandiose, then it might be harder to get developers to join in. So world domination does take time, so start small, and then expand the project aims as you go along. So what structure do you want? Usually start with a very simple structure, say one committer and easy contributions via email or patches or whatever. The more you want other people to contribute patches and code early on, the more structure you need at the beginning. Most projects start out with a small number of contributors, which means you don't need as much infrastructure, which means you don't need to spend as much time on administration and creating infrastructure. What license do you want? Don't invent a new license. There's very few projects that can really justify having a new license, and it will just cause you pain down the track if you choose some really obscure or create a new license and then have to change the license later. Because you then find that interacting with other projects is difficult. So imitating another project in the same area and choosing the license they're choosing, or choosing one of the most popular licenses, that's usually a good idea, unless you have some very specific needs. And if those specific needs lead you to think you're going to have to create your own license, then discuss it with some more experienced people in the free software world first. Because projects that have created new licenses have very often regretted it later, and they've found it's caused a lot of problems later with them using libraries and interacting with other projects. Source code management. Work out what you want to do for source code management. Fairly simple at the beginning. Pick a tool that you are familiar with and that hopefully other people are familiar with as well. Be a bad idea, for example, to start the project and then write your own source code management system for the project. That's probably a bad idea. You'll find that developers won't be familiar with your system. So pick one that there is tutorials around for, that other people are used to using, and that you're competent with, you know how to use. So there's lots out there to choose from. There's some really good source code management systems, and try a few of them on other projects and pick one that you're familiar with. Do you want to use a canned hosting site? That can be a very good idea. Hosting sites like Savannah, like GNAR, like SourceForge and others, Google Code, there's lots of others. I listed a few of them on the introductory lecture. Those canned hosting sites can be really good. They can make it very easy to get the project started. It also means it makes the project, it often makes it a bit less personal. And you may want the project to have a very personal feel. If you do, and you've got your own machine with a fixed IP address, you can create your own site. And so some projects prefer to have register their own domain name. So if you've got your project as foobar, foobar.org, and create that as your website, and you pay for hosting, etc. It sort of depends on the amount of effort you want to put into the initial creation. It's much easier to just start a project by going to something like SourceForge, clicking a few buttons, and you've got a new project. It's there instantly. That is much easier, but it can get lost a bit in the hundreds of thousands of other projects on that site. So if your project, if you want it to be something that eventually becomes part of your career, or if you want it to be something that is very distinctive, then it may be better rolling your own and creating your own website. And you'll notice that the more mature and larger projects tend to have their own website, projectname.org, rather than having using one of the canned sites. Was there questions?
Yes. About the tracking of the bugs. Is
Yep.
it necessary to have a tool available there? or you can do your procedure, or you can define a new procedure like.
You can define a new procedure. Using an existing bug tracking system is a good idea, I think, because people will be familiar with how to use it. For example, Bugzilla or Track or one of the other ones. Track is very popular. It's a very nice system, TRAC. But the early days of a project, the bug tracking system in the very early days is probably the least important. Because in the very early days, you'll have a small number of users who probably will be developers themselves, and the mailing list is possibly the best way, because you really want all the developers to see everyone else's discussions of bugs. Because you're really just forming the project at the beginning, and you really want as much communication going on as possible. Bug tracking systems, in many ways, are a way to cope with the volume of bugs being reported by large numbers of users. And they scale a lot better. But you can actually start out by just saying we don't have a bug tracking system, we're just going to have a mailing list, a discussion forum or something like that, and move to a real bug tracking system.
A mailing list is a bug tracking system.
Yeah, a mailing list is a form bug tracking system. It just doesn't scale, and it doesn't track things as well, because you don't, with a real bug tracking system, developers who've been signed bugs can get an email once a week to say, you know, what outstanding bugs they're supposed to work on, and you can prioritise them and you can link them back to source code changes. So they offer all these fancy utilities. But that also tends to mean that bugs can get sort of lost there and not be really visible to all of your developers. And in the really early days of the project, I think a project may be better off not having a bug tracking system. But it depends on the project. If your project is, for example, if it's starting off with a large established code base, which it's bringing in from somewhere else that you've written yourself, then it may be appropriate to launch straight into having a bug tracking system. But if you're really just writing it from scratch, then probably a bug tracking system will actually be more of a distraction than it will actually help the project.
One of the huge advantages we've found from having a canned hosting set up with SourceForge is that when you do file releases, it's automatically mirrored to release mirrors all around the world, and the downloads, you don't have to care about the bandwidth that's used. You don't.
Indeed.
It's not your problem.
Indeed.
It's on the box sitting under your desk. You care deeply about the bandwidth.
That's right. That's right. So indeed, the tracking, not worrying about how much bandwidth is being used. If your project has large files, video files, something like that in it, or you're likely to be very popular, then worrying about how much bandwidth it might use in downloads. If you host it on your home network, then indeed it might clag up your home network completely, so that your wife can't get a mail. And it can happen. You can get a lot of downloads for a popular project. That's particularly significant if it has very large files, an ISO or a virtual machine image or a big video or something like that. Then it can chew a lot of bandwidth when you get 50,000 people trying it out and downloading it, particularly if your project gets announced on one of the major sites like Slashdot. If it's an exciting, geeky type project and somebody puts up a notice on Slashdot, then your server might be dead for the next few days as tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people try to download your project, in which case hosting it on one of the major hosting sites can be a big advantage. So it costs us a few $100s a month in hosting fees at the moment to host Samba, because we have a reasonable number of downloads and people using the project, and we like it being hosted in a reliable facility. So you've got to decide, do you need a mailing list? The answer is probably yes. Mailing lists, particularly mailing lists, are very good in the early days of a project. They tend to be a very effective communication mechanism. Do you need an IRC channel? That depends how you want to work. IRC channels can be good and bad in the early days. They can provide a great way of having sort of instant discussions, quick discussions with people. But there is a disadvantage that people who aren't in the same time zones as the primary developers may not feel as though they can participate as easily. You can provide logs, IRC logs. For example, if you jump on the Samba IRC channel, then you'll notice that as soon as you log in, it prints a URL at the top, giving a place where you can click to see all the logs. So we automatically log all our IRC chats onto a public website, right? And that can lessen the amount that people are feel as though they're outside the project because they can't participate in the same time zones. So you've got to decide that. Are you the sort of person that prefers to chat on IRC, or are you the type of person that prefers to use a mailing list? And I think a mailing list at least is essential. And make sure it's archived. because new developers coming into the project, the first thing that they'll really want to do is read through the mailing list archive to get an idea for what the project culture is like. And so you really need to make sure it does archive and the archive is publicly accessible and that it works. That people are able to go easily and find the archive and use it. Do you need your own website? There probably should be at least some web presence, giving the basic information about the project. But in the early days, the website probably doesn't need to be very fancy. And if you spend all your time on web design and nothing on working on the project, that's a bad idea. Then again, the website may be what really attracts users to your project. The canned hosting sites make this easier, although if you use a canned hosting site, they usually offer the ability to create a real home page on that site. It's a good idea to learn how to do that because it allows you to make your project much more distinctive. And so people feel as though they can really be a part of a real project and it isn't just the standard sort of yellow and white or whatever SourceForge is offering at the time. Something a little bit more distinctive. So we've already talked about tracking of bugs, and my thought is that bug tracking isn't essential in the really early days of a project. Working code, before the first announcement, you should get something working, something that tempts people to get involved. Because your very first announcement is where you're likely to get your initial flush of developers. And if there's nothing at all working, then really it's just vaporware and a vaporware project, and people will get turned off and may not look at your project again. So working code gives positive feedback from potential contributors and users, but it doesn't have to be perfect code. And as I talked about yesterday, in fact, a few bugs, a few obvious missing features can be good in the early days of a project. So follow common conventions. Have a look how related or similar projects handle their build and coding issues. Don't invent your own build system to start with. Use either AutoComp for Ant or one of the other CMake or one of the other popular build systems. And so it's easy for people who've used other free software projects to get started, because your best early contributors would be people who have contributed to other free software projects, because they're likely to be the more experienced developers which you'd really like to attract to the new project. So make it easy for people who've already built other free software projects to build and try your project. So follow their lead and use the conventions that are established in the free software community. First impressions really matter. You need to make it easy to build and try the first time. It should be a matter of just a few minutes from download to getting the first bit of feedback. Announcing the project. You need to announce it somewhere so people know that it exists. Adding the project to FreshMeet is sort of the minimum. Freshmeet.net is a great place for announcing a project. It means it gets, for a few hours at least, it's up there saying there's a new project available, and a lot of people look at FreshMeet regularly. I've discovered lots of new projects by looking on FreshMeet. It also means your project can be searched for and found more easily. Finding a mailing list for closely related projects can be a very good idea. I've often done that. So I go and find some mailing list. If I'm, say, starting Ccache, I might find a mailing list where Ccache is likely to be useful, like the kernel list or the compiler list or something like that. For Samba, I announced it on a Pathworks list, which is a related protocol. So you might find an existing mailing list for some related project. Maybe not a competing project, depends on the attitudes of the people in the competing project. If you're creating the next better editor, then announcing it on other editor mailing lists, they might appreciate it, they might not. It depends on how they feel about competition. And but announcing it into a mailing list that's likely to have a number of users or potential developers that would be interested in the project, great idea. Don't spam every list. Don't send it out to 100 different mailing lists. People will get really turned off. They get enough spam already, and if they think your project is trying to spam out to lots and lots of people, then they're just going to get a bad impression of your project. So pick, 1, 2, maybe 3 places that you might announce it. Be humble. Don't oversell the project. Don't, as I said earlier, don't be grandiose about your plans. Keep it simple, and don't claim that it's going to solve world hunger, unless it's called worldhunger.org. So make sure you include vital project information. What is it for? What programming language? A lot of people will want to work on a project in a language that they're familiar with. So make it clear what languages are involved that you've decided to use. What platforms does it target? Don't just assume that everyone out there is running the same platform as you. If it targets a particular platform, or if it targets a range of platforms, you might say something like, I've been testing it on my Ubuntu Linux system, but it should work on any other Linux system. Something like that. Or you say any work on any Unix-like system, or whatever it is, make sure people know what type of platforms you're targeting. What license have you chosen? Just the short form, you don't need to include a copy of the license, just say something like, I've chosen the artistic license, or I've chosen the GPL, or I've chosen the LGPL, or whatever it is. So include that information, and of course a link to where people can find out more details. So keep the announcement short, but have a URL where they can find out more information. Okay, nurturing the project. So to get it going early on, you need to give positive feedback to people who contribute. Assuming you're after programming contributions, you need to make sure you give them the positive feedback. And every time somebody makes a contribution, answer that contribution, be encouraging, answer the email fast, encourage IRDC discussions if you've got an IRC channel, and be friendly, welcoming, and you may find you've got a lot of lurkers. You often find, say you announce a project, you get a few hundred people joining the mailing list, but actually only 2 or 3 contribute, and the other people on the list are what's called lurkers, right? They're sitting there reading, but they're not actually participating. But those lurkers are the potential contributors, and their decision as to whether they're going to get involved really depends on what's going on that mailing list. Does it look like a friendly environment? Does this look like the type of thing that they want to get involved with? So when you're talking on the list, you're replying not just to the individual, but your replies are going out to those 200 or 300 people who are lurking on the list, and you're trying to attract them to get more involved. So make sure that you might, in answering a question, say, and if anyone else has a similar problem, you might like to see this site for more information. So be extra generous in providing your time to help out people who might be able to contribute. And remember that even if their contribution is not so good to start with, everyone has to start somewhere in learning how to program, in learning how to contribute. Encourage them, because you may find that they, through getting involved in your project, their coding skills improve, and a few years down the track, in fact, they're a fantastic developer and they're the next release manager or something. There's a lot of people who've joined the Samba project over the years who started out with enthusiasm but without necessarily very much skill. But now they're fantastic programmers, and they've become great programmers through their participation in free software projects. So you need to understand that at the beginning, if you think their code is a bit rough and not so good, people can learn very quickly through the participation in projects. So don't put them off. Don't say, we don't want your kind around here, you're putting your braces in the wrong spot or whatever. Be friendly and encouraging early on. Okay, releases. Get releases out fast and frequently. I'd suggest that in the early days of a project, it's a good idea to make releases even though you probably have some source code management system allowing people to download at any point. If you've already got enough developers coming in, then sure, you might think it's not so necessary. But if you do want to encourage more and you really want to grow the project, then fast release announcements is one thing that seems to be very effective. Your release number should be going up every few days, and so automate the process of putting out a release. So it's really, really easy and painless for you to throw out a new release. Nobody will have an expectation of the project being perfect in the early days. Releases don't need to be perfect, but new releases encourage activity, encourage people to get involved. You can use snapshot releases, sort of daily releases or something, but automated releases tend not to encourage people to develop as much. If there isn't a bit of a personal touch, some message from the developer saying something about what's happened and why they're doing a release now, then it tends not to have the same positive impact as a release where the developer is saying, this is great, we've reached the following milestone, we've now got this feature going, saying something a little bit personal. That will tend to get more people to get involved. Post a summary of changes in each release. Many source code management systems can automate that, can produce a short change log with all the crediting automatically in a reasonable format. And you'll see a lot of projects have this little change log that comes out in announcements. Sometimes that's manually written. Very often that is automatically generated from the source code management system. But it depends which source code management system you're using and whether it credits people appropriately. If it isn't giving credits in the right places, then make sure you edit that little change log that goes out to make sure you credit the right people with who's contributed what. Even if they didn't write the code, if somebody suggests an idea and then you implement it yourself, credit them with the idea. Right? If somebody finds the bug and points out the bug and you fix the bug, credit them with the bug. Right? The idea is to not keep credit for yourself. The idea is to give credit to other people who are doing useful things. So even bug reporters, users, discussions in the IRC channel. Thanks to the discussion I had with Fred in the IRC channel, we've now got the following feature working. You might have done all the work, but give them the credit. Encourage them to participate. Okay, so that's really belaboring the point on encouragement. So as the project grows, you need to start thinking about a few more things. Do you want to start doing packaging for the major distributions? So do you want to do Red Hat packages, Ubuntu, Debian packages, Mandriva packages, whatever, SUSE packages? Maybe you think that's a good way to grow the project, to make it easier for users to start using the project. Because as the project starts to grow and mature, your focus will tend to be more onto users than other developers. And so you want to start making it easier for end users and maybe less emphasis on new developers. You might have plenty of developers already, but no users. Right? All the developers could also be the users. Do you want to do binary packages? So the packaging for major distros could just be a matter of doing the description files that allow the packages to be built for each distro. Right? This might be that you actually produce binary packages for some specific architectures that you've got available to you. You might even put out a call on the mailing list for people, volunteers, to build the package for particular architectures. Sometimes that happens by itself. You decide you're not going to do binary packages, then somebody announces to your mailing list, "Hi, I'm now hosting binary packages on the following site." If you do that, then you should add to your website a link to their site to say, binary packages packaged up by Fred are available over here at this site, so that other people can find those binary packages, and that encourages that person who's doing the packaging to do more of it and to keep them up to date, etc. Okay. Should you write articles for magazines or websites? You might like to write an article up for one of the many, many websites about free software and talking about the development of the project, talking about the status it's at, showing screenshots, giving a tutorial on how it works, that sort of thing. That can be great PR for your project. Should you have a development blog? That's very popular these days, to have a blog or to use Twitter and put out little announcements over things that are happening. And then if you get that blog aggregated into one of the planets, then you'll find a lot more people will read about the development of your project. And if they see regular updates coming out on a blog saying, "Hey, we've just got this great new feature," that will attract people to come into your project. And it's like having a new announcement, regularly of your active project and showing that it is active. So that can be a really good idea. Project structure, you need to regularly reevaluate how the project is working. Start thinking, have I got the right balance of developers and users and ease of use? What do I need to do to change that balance if it's not going the way I want? Am I motivating people in the right way? Is it taking up too much of my life and I've just lost my wife and or girlfriend or whatever because I'm spending all my life on this project? You need to start evaluating those things on a regular basis so that you can decide if the project's going in the right direction and change direction if need be, or get in more people to help out, appeal for help on doing particularly difficult parts of the project, that sort of thing. Once the project grows, you also might decide whether you want to formalise the structure. Do you want to incorporate, do you want to become part of the SFLC Conservancy, Software Freedom Conservancy? Do you want to become part of some other group of project, affiliated with the GNU project or with the GNOME or KDE or Apache projects? And if you do, make sure you discuss it first. You don't just go and make the decision and suddenly the whole project changes direction. Discuss it on the mailing list, say I'm thinking of doing this, does anyone have any opinions, that type of thing. Otherwise you'll really alienate your developer base if you just start making big decisions by fiat. And do you also need to start defining project roles? You might put out announcements saying, hey, I think we now need a separate release manager role. Is there anyone who volunteers to be the release manager? Maybe nobody will put their hand up, maybe they will. Or we really need somebody to look after the mailing list regularly and handle the bounces and the subscription requests. Maybe we need somebody to tend to the bug tracking system. So announce that you might need a role and see if you get a volunteer, right? And then encourage them, work with them a little bit, mentor them in the first process. It can be a difficult feeling. When you first do this, you ask for somebody to take over a particular role, and it sometimes can feel as though you don't want to give up your baby, right? Give up your part in that role, but it really is important to do that, to allow other people to take on important roles in the project, to allow the project to grow. And what you might do is you might do releases together. When I first handed over release management for some of my projects, we might log in together and use something like Screen to allow us to both see, we're in different parts of the world, we can log in together but see each other's typing. There's a nice little program called GNU Screen that allows that. And so I might have done the release, but they were then watching exactly what I typed. Or they do the release and I watch, and we're on the phone at the same time, we're walking through it. To sort of walk them through the process so they understand it, so that the release doesn't come out in a strange way, but they also get the chance to then start building up their skills. Okay, so scaling up the project. How do you scale it up? FOSS projects can grow very quickly, particularly if you follow all the suggestions that I've given in this talk. You may find that it grows amazingly fast, sometimes scarily fast. And the project can suddenly become very popular. You get on Slashdot and you get thousands of people, and it really can be quite a wild ride. Is there too much load on the one person? You know, should you break the project up into modules? Should you subdivide the source code so that it's easier for people to have a role of looking after a piece of the code and give them a defined role? If there is, you should then create a file in the project called something like maintainers that says this person is now the person in charge of this section, this person is in charge of that section, etc., and make sure you coordinate with those people. So if it gets far too big for you, very good idea to break it up. You might like to start having separate mailing lists for different parts. That's not a good idea in the really early days for a project. You probably just want one mailing list for both users and developers and the lot. You don't imitate other projects. Another project that you admire might have 10 different mailing lists, but it's a mature, old project. If you start your project in the early days with 10 mailing lists or even 3 mailing lists, it'll tend to split people up, and you'll find that they'll end up posting the same message to all 3, and people won't like that to get 3 copies of the message in their inbox. You really want to have a small, tight-knit community at the beginning. But as the project scales up, you may want a separate users mailing list, a developers mailing list, and maybe a mailing list for the releases or a mailing list for clients or servers or whatever, for bug tracking separately. But that's really once you've got in the order of thousands to tens of thousands of people on these mailing lists, not at the early stages when you've got half a dozen people who are contributing. So don't scale it up. Don't scale up the infrastructure beyond what the project has grown to be. Delegate. It's like giving people a role. If you can ask for volunteers for a role. You can also ask particular people, I've noticed you've been doing great code on this, would you mind taking over the following role? And then if you do, announce them as that role. Announce that this person is now in charge of that section of the project. Make sure they are publicly given the authority to control that particular section of the project. Okay, things that can help. Posting a regular development summary can be really good. And if somebody is a good writer, and getting them to write, say, a weekly or a monthly, either a blog posting or a posting on the main page of the site, announcing what's been happening recently, that can be a very good way to engage the user and developer community. And what that person would do is go back and look at all the postings on the mailing lists in the last week or month and then summarise them. There's some very good examples of that on things like lwn.net, summaries of Linux kernel development and summaries of other projects. And it can be a really worthwhile way of engaging more people, particularly as the project grows to be too large and too busy for some people to be involved with. If the project has hundreds of messages on its mailing list every day, then a lot of people who might be able to make valuable contributions won't be able to keep up with that load of mail. But they might be able to keep up with a weekly or monthly summary mail, and that summary mail will sort of allow them to still know what's going on and maybe still participate in the project. Okay, do you want to start a project conference? Most projects, their first conference would be something called a mini-conf. How many of you have been to a mini-conf? A few? Yep. Okay, a mini-conf is a lot of the major Linux conferences have these things called mini-confs, usually just before the main conference. So the Linux Conference Australia typically has 2 days before the start of the conference for all the mini-confs. And mini-confs are mini-conferences. They're like just a room where anyone can turn up that's interested in a particular topic. So for example, MySQL might have a mini-conf, or if you're working on the Westnoff game and you don't think the Westnoff game is quite big enough to have its own conference yet, but you might think that, aha, we'll have a mini-conf, just a room offered for free by an existing conference the day before the start of the conference where anyone interested in Westnoff development gets together and chats and shows what they've been doing and does a bit of coding on it together. That can be very good. You can also have something called a birds of a feather session, usually known as a BOF. Anyone been to a BOF? A few people? Great. A BOF is, it's like even smaller than a mini-conf. Usually what happens is people attend some conference and you discover there's a few other people at the conference who are interested in a particular topic. And there's often a whiteboard somewhere people can write up BOFs. So you might write up on the whiteboard PC Gen BOF 5:30 in whatever room. Okay, and there's usually a time of an hour or two that is set aside for BOFs. Then what happens is anyone who's at that conference, there might be hundreds of people at the conference who are interested in that topic, turn up, and it might be only half a dozen people. And they gather around and chat about the project, what's going on. You can gather new developers and users that way. You can chat directly to them. And a BOF is very little trouble to set up as long as you're already attending the conference, and it can be a great way to get new people involved. The next step up from that is a mini-conf. The next step up from that is to create your own conference. And the larger projects tend to have, a conference either affiliated with an existing conference or their own standalone conference. But it usually only reaches that point when the project's been around for a long time and it's got a lot of developers and users. Because running a conference is a major piece of work. You can spend 6 months of your life setting up a conference.
Sometimes poster presentations sit in there somewhere too, between a BOF and a mini-conf.
Yes, that's right. You can do a poster presentation. You can create a poster about your project and you can pin that poster up at an existing conference that's likely to have other people at the conference who are interested. Now, some conferences formalise it where you have to apply to give a poster. Some of them will just have a bit of board space where you can go bring your poster along and just sort of pin it up. And people can learn a bit about your project by just seeing what's on the pin board. More commonly, you have to actually apply. Giving a talk at a conference can be a good thing. Show off your project by applying at one of the Linux conferences like LCA or the Open Source Developer Conference. Both of those are annual conferences here in Australia. And apply to give a talk about your project and demonstrate the project. Okay, look at how other projects handle growth. Pick an approach that worked for them. There's lots of different approaches to handle the massive growth you can sometimes get in a project, and talk to other project leaders and say, we're having this great big problem, how did you cope with it? And get ideas from them. You'll usually find that project leaders from other projects are very willing to share their experiences and to suggest ways of coping with whatever difficulty you might have run into. So that's it. So I deliberately kept that lecture a bit short this morning because we now don't leave as much time as possible for your presentations. So we'll break for morning tea very briefly, And say 20 past, we start in 10 minutes time. We'll go back into the lab. No,
Start the presentations.
we're going to start the presentation, say 20 past. Yep.
I thought they weren't until this afternoon.
Well, we have to need both labs.
Okay.
We wouldn't, I mean, 21 people for 10 minutes each doesn't fit in the lab this afternoon.
Okay.
So no, the project presentations, I think we had that up on the,
It's 2 time blocks.
okay, it's 2 time blocks, I think, in the schedule. And the first one, project presentation is 10:45, so in half an hour's time. But I think we should start a bit early because with 21 people, 10 minutes each, some minutes for changeover and discussion. We're going to be here quite late tonight if we don't do that, and I presume you all want to have dinner. So I'd suggest that we get started early. Otherwise, we're going to end up some people at sort of 9 o'clock tonight, you know, still trying to get their presentation done.
10:25.
Okay, sorry?
10:25.
10:25?
That's the compromise.
Okay, 10:25.